Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're generating that high-yield, quick summary you really need from menopause pharmacology. Smart, targeted therapeutic decisions.
Yeah, we're diving deep into the clinical pearls, focusing on managing those symptoms that come with declining estrogen.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we start?
Well, first, just defining it. Menopause, it's the permanent end of menstruation. Basically, ovarian failure leads to this endocrinopathy.
Right.
And think about it. A healthy woman spends maybe a third of her life post-menopause. So managing symptoms is, well, huge.
Huge impact on quality of life.
Exactly. And we're zeroing in on the two big symptom categories. Vasomotor symptoms, VMS is hot flashes, affects up to 87% of women, lasting maybe a minute to 5.
Okay, VMS.
And the other is Genitourinary Syndrome of Menopause, or GSM. Vaginal dryness, pain, those kinds of things.
And the core physiology behind it all, it's that drop in ovarian estradiol and progesterone production, isn't it?
Precisely. So when those hormone levels fall, there's less negative feedback on the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And that's why you see that characteristic rise in follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH. It's measurable.
So that mechanism tells us what we're aiming for with treatment.
You got it. The main goal is simple, really. Reduce symptom severity, reduce frequency, improve quality of life.
But there's been a big shift in thinking, right, about long-term use.
A critical shift. You need to internalize this. Hormone therapy, HT, it is no longer acceptable for preventing chronic conditions, things like heart disease or dementia. That's out.
So we're purely focused on symptoms now.
Exclusively for symptom management. That's based on clear prospective trial data. No more prevention claims for HT.
Okay, so if the goal is symptom relief, especially those VMS, hormone therapy is still the most effective tool we have.
Absolutely. It remains the heavyweight champion for VMS. The data shows it cuts hot flash frequency by 75%.
Wow, 75%.
And intensity by 87%.
Plus, and this is big for quality of life, improves sleep. Reduces sleep latency, how long it takes to fall asleep.
That's significant. But getting the regimen right is crucial. You mentioned safety guardrails. It's non-negotiable. It comes down to anatomy.
Oh.
Has the patient had a hysterectomy?
Okay.
If yes, they can safely take estrogen alone. ET.
ET for hysterectomy. Got it.
But if the woman still has her uterus, she must get estrogen plus progestin, EPT.
And the why behind that is critical.
It's endometrial protection. Unopposed estrogen, meaning estrogen without progestin in someone with a uterus, significantly bumps up the risk for endometrial hyperplasia.
Which can lead to cancer.
Exactly, endometrial cancer. So the progestin is there purely to protect the uterus. That's its job in EPT.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned trial data. The Women's Health Initiative, the WHI studies, they really shaped how we view HT safety, didn't they?
They really did. They gave us our modern safety framework. But what's fascinating and maybe a bit sobering is how quickly the benefit seemed to fade in those trials.
How so?
Well, they saw statistically significant improvements in VMS severity and quality of life metrics, things like sleep, pain, but mostly in the first year of combined EPT.
Only the first year.
Well, significantly. By year 3, those differences were, frankly, barely noticeable clinically. They pretty much vanished.
Huh. So it really makes you question the long-term risk-benefit balance if the main benefit dwindles that fast.
Exactly. It forces us to constantly reassess. Now, when you do start therapy, you need reasonable starting doses in mind.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Sure. You might start with, say, 0.025 milligrams of transdermal estradiol. That's a batch. Or maybe 0.5 milligrams of oral estradiol. Or 0.3 milligrams of conjugated equine estrogen, CEE.
Okay, those are common starting points.
Yes. And that brings up the road of administration. Oral versus transdermal is a matter for VMS. The evidence doesn't strongly favor one over the other for symptom relief itself.
But what about safety? You hear about patches potentially being safer regarding blood clots.
Yeah.
VTE risks.
Ah, yes, that's a key point. Transdermal delivery, so patches, gels, also vaginal routes, they bypass first-pass metabolism in the liver.
Unlike pills.
Right. Pills go through the liver first. And it's thought that this avoidance of the liver is why transdermal HT seems to have a lower risk of venous thromboembolism, VTE, compared to oral forms.
So for a patient with VTE risk factors, a patch might be a better choice.
It's definitely a consideration, yes. It's part of tailoring therapy.
Okay, so HT tackles the systemic stuff, the VMS, pretty well. But what about those genitourinary syndrome of menopause symptoms? The GSM.
Right, GSM. This is different. Unlike VMS, which might lessen over time for some, GSM symptoms, vaginal dryness, burning, pain with intercourse, dyspareunia, they tend to be chronic. and progressive,
Affecting a lot of women too, right?
up to 40% of midlife women. So yeah, our treatment approach has to be different here. These symptoms often don't just go away on their own.
So systemic HT might not be the first thought if only GSM is the issue.
Exactly. If the only reason for considering hormones is vaginal symptoms, we should strongly consider topical vaginal products first.
Gels, creams, rings, tablets.
Yes, because they deliver the estrogen right where it's needed, with much less getting into the rest of the body, the systemic circulation.
And how effective are these localized treatments compared to systemic HT for GSM?
Interestingly, the efficacy data favors the local approach for local symptoms. Vaginal products show about 80% to 90% efficacy for GSM.
Wow, that's high.
It is. Compare that to around 75% efficacy for GSM symptoms when using systemic HT.
So better results with potentially lower systemic risk if GSM is the main problem.
Precisely. It really supports that idea. Don't use a systemic sledgehammer if a targeted tap will do.
Can you give us a couple of examples of how these vaginal products are dosed?
Sure. There's a low-dose estradiol ring, for instance, that releases about 7.5 micrograms daily over 90 days. Very convenient.
Okay.
Or vaginal tablets. A typical start is using one daily for about 2 weeks, then dropping down to a maintenance dose, maybe twice a week.
And because the absorption is so low,
Well,
what about the progestin? Do you still need it with vaginal estrogen if the woman has a uterus?
great question. Current thinking is that for these low-dose vaginal formulations, the systemic absorption is so minimal that adding a progestin likely isn't necessary to protect the endometrium.
So safer from that perspective.
It appears so, yes. Unlike systemic ET, though we should acknowledge really long-term data on endometrial safety with vaginal estrogen alone is still somewhat limited.
Good point. Now, before we leave GSM and HT, there's another quality of life issue, libido. That often declines too, right?
It does. The drop in testosterone that can happen around menopause can definitely impact sexual desire for some women.
Is there anything pharmacologically we can offer for that specifically?
Yes, for women who have that bothersome decrease in libido while on HT, adding low-dose testosterone is an option. We're talking maybe 1.25 to 2.5 milligrams of methyl testosterone daily.
Added to their HT?
Correct. But you absolutely have to counsel about the potential side effects.
Like what?
Things like hirsutism, unwanted hair growth, potential voice deepening, and importantly, it can decrease HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol. So it's a trade-off discussion.
Okay, we've touched on risks, but let's circle back to the big safety signals, especially from WHI. What were the major concerns identified, particularly with combined EPT?
The WHI estrogen plus progestin arm showed clear, statistically significant increased risks for several serious conditions.
Such as
Stroke, coronary heart disease, pulmonary embolism, and invasive breast cancer.
Right. The breast cancer risk is often highlighted. How significant was that increase in WHI?
It helps to quantify it. The data showed roughly an additional 8 cases of invasive breast cancer per 10,000 women each year after 5 years of using combined EPT.
8 per 10,000 per year after 5 years. Putting it that way helps frame the absolute risk for patients.
Absolutely. It's much clearer than just saying increased risk.
Okay.
We need to communicate those absolute numbers.
And based on these kinds of risks, there are definite situations where HT is just not an option, the absolute contraindications.
Correct. The chapter lays these out clearly, like in box 55.1 if you were looking at the text.
Can you list the key ones for us?
Sure. Absolute contraindications include known or suspected breast cancer or other estrogen-dependent cancers like endometrial cancer.
Okay.
Also, untreated endometrial hyperplasia, uncontrolled hypertension, that's a big one, active liver disease, and any active thromboembolic disease like DVT or PE, or even a history of it. If any of those are present, HT is off the table. We have to pivot.
Right. So considering these risks and the fading benefit over time, how do we approach the duration of therapy now? Is it still just lowest dose, shortest time?
It's more nuanced now. The thinking has shifted towards the appropriate dose, duration, regimen, and route, considering the individual's timing relative to menopause. It's sort of an age and time window.
Explain that window.
Generally, for women who are younger, say 59 or under, and who are within 10 years of their menopause onset, the benefits of HT for VMS and also preventing bone loss usually outweigh the risks. That's the sweet spot.
Are younger and closer to menopause onset.
Yes. But for women who are older, maybe over 60, or those starting HT much later, like 10 or even 20 years after menopause began, the benefit-risk calculation looks less favorable.
Why less favorable?
Because in that older group or later starters, there's a greater absolute risk of those serious events: coronary heart disease, stroke, VTE, and even dementia compared to the potential benefit.
So timing really matters.
Critically, therapy has to be individualized. It needs to be revisited every year. A serious discussion about continuing. And generally, using combined HT beyond 3 to 5 years is discouraged because that breast cancer risk appears to climb more significantly after that point.
Okay, so HT has its place, but clearly not for everyone. What do we offer patients with contraindications or those who just prefer a non-hormonal route?
Thankfully, we have some solid alternatives now. Let's look at the category called estrogen agonist antagonists. You'll see them called SERMs or TSECs.
SERMs, selective estrogen receptor modulators.
Exactly. One key SERM here is ospemifene, brand name Osphena.
And what's its niche?
It's specifically FDA approved for dyspareunia, that pain with intercourse, which is a GSM symptom.
How does it work?
It acts like an estrogen agonist in the vaginal tissues, which helps with dryness and atrophy, but it only has weak estrogen activity in the uterus.
Is it completely risk-free then?
No, unfortunately. It carries a boxed warning about increased risk for VTE and cardiovascular disease. So it still requires careful patient selection and counseling.
Okay. And you mentioned TSCCs?
Yes, TSEC stands for Tissue Selective Estrogen Complex. The main one is marketed as Duavi.
What's in Duavi?
It's a combination product, conjugated equine estrogen, CEE, plus an estrogen agonist-antagonist called bazedoxifene.
And its use.
It's approved for moderate to severe VMS, the hot flashes.
So it contains estrogen. Why doesn't it need a separate progestin for uterine protection?
That's the clever part. The bazedoxifene component acts as an estrogen antagonist in the endometrium, so it blocks estrogen's effects there, providing the uterine protection itself. No separate progestin needed.
Interesting combination. Okay, moving beyond SERMs and TSCCs, what are the go-to non-hormonal options for VMS? I know certain antidepressants are used.
Yes, SSRIs and SNRIs are commonly used, though it's important to note only one specific formulation of paroxetine, branded Bristol, is actually FDA approved for VMS.
The Bristol, got it. But others are used off-label.
Correct. Venlafaxine, desvenlafaxine, citalopram, escitalopram are also used.
And how do they work for hot flashes? It's not hormonal.
The mechanism isn't fully nailed down, but it's thought to involve their influence on the brain's thermoregulatory center, likely via serotonin and norepinephrine pathways in the hypothalamus.
Okay, makes sense. How quickly do these work compared to HT?
That's a key difference and important for patient expectations. Unlike HT, which can bring relief relatively quickly, the effects of SSRIs or SNRIs for VMS usually take longer. You're looking at maybe 4 to 8 weeks to see a noticeable effect.
4 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, and the reduction in hot flashes is typically in the range of 30% to 75%. So often effective, but maybe not quite as dramatically as HT for some.
Important counseling point. Any major safety flags with using these for VMS?
The big one is the interaction with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs. You absolutely cannot use SSRIs or SNRIs within 14 days of an MAOI.
Why not?
Risk of serotonin syndrome, which can be life-threatening. And of course, they come with their own side effects. Nausea, dizziness, sexual dysfunction are pretty common.
Okay. Are there any other non-hormonal agents used for VMS?
Yes, 2 others worth mentioning. Gabapentin, which is actually an anticonvulsant medication.
How does that work for hot flashes?
We don't really know the mechanism for VMS, but it does seem to help. However, it can also take a while to see the full effect, maybe up to 12 weeks. And side effects like drowsiness and dizziness are common.
Right, gabapentin, and the last one.
Clonidine. This is an older drug, a centrally acting alpha-2 agonist, mostly used for blood pressure.
But used off-label for VMS.
Yes. Again, the thinking is it acts centrally on that thermoregulatory center, but because it lowers blood pressure.
Hypotension is a major concern.
Exactly. Hypotension can be a significant side effect or even a contraindication if the woman already has low blood pressure. Needs careful monitoring. So let's say you've started a patient on HT or even one of these alternatives. What's the monitoring plan look like?
It sounds like it needs to be pretty rigorous, especially for HT.
Absolutely. The decision to continue HT isn't automatic. It really needs to be revisited seriously every single year.
So no automatic refills for years on end.
Definitely not. Before renewing an HT prescription, you need a full annual evaluation. That includes a clinical breast exam, a comprehensive pelvic exam with a pap smear as indicated, checking blood pressure, and getting a fasting lipid panel.
Okay, comprehensive check-in. And when it is time to stop HT, can patients just quit cold turkey?
Not recommended. Stopping abruptly can lead to a pretty unpleasant rebound of symptoms, especially VMS.
Ah.
So discontinuation should be done gradually, tapering the dose, maybe skipping days or slowly lowering the dose over several weeks, like at 4 to 6 week intervals.
Gradual taper to avoid rebound. Makes sense. What about patient education? What are the critical safety points we need to make sure patients understand?
Well, first, setting expectations about response time, especially for the non-hormonal options like SSRIs or gabapentin taking weeks to work.
Right.
But the absolute priority is educating on the signs and symptoms of a VTE, a blood clot.
Like DVT or PE.
Exactly. Patients need to know to look for things like sudden warmth, redness or swelling in a leg, or acute shortness of breath, or sharp chest pain.
And what should they do if they experience those?
Seek immediate medical attention. Don't wait. That message has to be crystal clear.
Okay. And beyond the pharmacology, what about lifestyle or non-pharmacologic advice? Does that help?
It definitely can. Lifestyle adjustments should always be part of the conversation. For VMS, some women find that minimizing intake of things like refined sugars, caffeine, and alcohol helps reduce hot flashes.
Things that can be triggered.
Potentially, yes. Other general advice includes dressing in layers so you can adjust easily, definitely smoking cessation, and weight management or weight loss is appropriate. Obesity is a risk factor for more severe VMS.
And for GSM, the vaginal symptoms.
For GSM, practical advice is really effective. Encouraging regular sexual activity, if comfortable, helps maintain vaginal health. And using long-acting vaginal moisturizers regularly, plus lubricants during intercourse, can make a huge difference in comfort. #outro.
This has been incredibly helpful, really drilling down into the practical aspects. If you had to summarize the key takeaway for an advanced practice student listening, what would it be?
I'd say it's about nuanced decision-making. HT is undeniably the most effective option for VMS, but its ideal use is really for younger women, closer to menopause onset, after a thorough risk assessment.
And for everyone else.
For women with contraindications, or who prefer non-hormonal options, or primarily have GSM, we have good, targeted alternatives. Ospemifene, TSCCs, SSRIs, NRIs, gabapentin, clonidine, and localized vaginal therapies. It's about matching the right tool to the right patient profile and symptom complex.
Excellent summary. Before we wrap up, do you have a final thought for our listeners to ponder as they integrate this into their practice?
Yes, something the chapter touched on that really makes you think. It mentioned a study finding that even when HT was clearly contraindicated, for example, in women treated for estrogen-dependent cancer, almost 20% still chose to take HT anyway, presumably for severe symptom relief.
Wow, nearly 1 in 5 despite the contraindication.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it raises this fundamental question you'll face constantly in patient-centered care. How do you balance that hard clinical evidence of risk, which you know inside and out, with a patient's own experience of debilitating symptoms, their quality of life, and ultimately their autonomy in making decisions about their own bodies? Well, it's the art of medicine meeting the science.
A really profound point to consider, balancing evidence, quality of life, and patient choice. That's certainly something to keep in mind. You are now definitely better equipped with the high-yield information to navigate menopause pharmacology safely and effectively. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.